I can like pass them around.
Actually, yeah. It's there.
Right, well, but maybe I should have it to announce things, but actually maybe I'll put it back. And I can be like online, it can be like the invisible chair. Are they coming or are they chatting? No chatting. We're starting. Like best primary school teacher mode. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to announce Joanna, who's going to be talking about revising whiteness in research on racism and health inequalities, and is promising all the examples to back up what Azita just said. Fantastic.
So hello, everyone. I don't have all the examples because here I just focus on research on health inequities. So my talk will be, I hope I will be quick. I will start with some discussion on the use of the category of whiteness in research on racism and health inequities. Then I will discuss some issues that goes with it. I will also talk about the racialization of Eastern Europeans and then how it impacts the differences in COVID outcomes during the pandemic. So I don't need to explain that there is more and more literature about racism and health each year. And usually the racism in such research in like medical papers, epidemiological papers and so on is defined as some kind of system that affords power and privilege according to non-established hierarchies based on racial categories. But what are those racial categories, right? So in this case, I couldn't imagine better talk than Azita's before me, because of course those categories are usually the US categories. And I'm gonna show you some numbers here. And those are two meta-analyses, one from 2006, another from 2023, showing that most of the papers, they use US ethno-racial categorization. They are, of course, also conducted in the US context. What is important in the context of my talk is that in most cases, the OMB ethno-racial classifications are also conceptually reduced to a very hardcore binary division into whites that are usually conceptualized as a default comparison group, and non-whites, including like many different racialized groups, for example, Blacks and Latina or Asians. Why this is a problem? First of all, that kind of categorization also spills over outside of the US, as Azita tried to explained. Here is a reference to a great paper proposed by Molinari, published by Molinari with his team, that even though in the European Union there are no explicit recommendations to use ethno-racial classifications in research on drug labels, there is this tendency to do that just because, for example, many companies, before they submit their research or their submissions for new drugs and so on to the FDA, they do that in Europe and so on. They usually just want to make it quicker and easier for them. So they also use the FDA recommendations. But it's not only about drug labels. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just get used to using my computer to do that. So yeah, so this is the number of papers on racism and health. The definitions I told you about. Yeah, sorry, really sorry about that. Maybe just look there. So this is this issue that in many cases the categorization constructed in the US, by the way, it's changing. The OMB introduced a new classification that includes also South Asians as another race. It also affects like the design of research in Europe. Finally, most researchers use the US categorization just because there is a huge epistemic injustice in science. If you check, for example, how many scientists from Eastern Europe are in editorial boards of the most important scientific journals, there is very few of them generally. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. There is a lot of studies presenting this problem in science already. So what are the main problems with applying OMB categorization, particularly in research on racism and health inequities? There are few discussions about this problem already. Usually, of course, they are happening in the US, and among US researchers, they are, for example, mentioning the problem of blurring responsibility, and I totally get it. If people don't talk about the fact that people racialized as whites are responsible for inequities, then we overlook the problem, right? So this is one of the topics that usually appears in this context. Another one is normalizing and stereotyping, white privilege. So, for example, category of whites is usually, as I said, used as a default comparison group. It is usually conceptualized as a homogeneous group as well, and as a group that is by default somehow better than others, which is totally not true, even if we analyze the research on health inequities. Usually, why in some health outcomes, people racialized as whites, they perform better than others. In other health outcomes, they are, if not the worst, then at least worse than some other groups, especially, for example, people racialized as Asians, or people racialized as Latina. In some contexts, they perform much worse than people racialized as whites. And finally, the data aggregation. This is actually a huge problem, and it's also discussed within the US context more and more in the last few years. So when it comes to health inequities, if the data is disaggregated to include more more racialized groups, for example, when it also includes Eastern European migrants in the US, then in many cases, the differences between such groups are even higher than between other racialized groups. So what I'm trying to say here is that from my point of view, that kind of narration is actually rooted so deeply in our thinking about racism, and it's actually one of the causes of racism as well, that it makes it difficult for us to actually study and recognize some ethno-racial inequities, especially outside of the US context. And here, just an example, I have the UK way of classifying ethnicities. And by the way, in UK, as I am aware, there is just the switch of the word race and ethnicity as well, right? Usually when people talk about it, many people understand ethnicity as race as well. So what is interesting from my point of view is that, for example, if you look closer to the group racialized as whites, then we see that it combines groups such as like normal whites, English, Welsh, Scottish, and so on. Irish is another racialized groups here. Then it also includes gypsies and or Irish travelers. From 2021, it's also Roma and Romani people are whites. And other whites, it usually it is usually a group that is used, for example, by migrants from Eastern Europe. And why it's interesting? It is because, for example, like many institutions that focus on fighting with health inequities recognize group racialized as Eastern Europeans, and it's the official recommendation that as one of the BME groups, so groups that can be affected by racism. But at the same time, if you check in PubMed for publications about health inequities in Europe, I could find only one that explicitly recognize Eastern Europeans as those that can face racism. But you can ask me, like, okay, how is it possible that people who have a lighter tone of the skin can face or experience racism? Usually racism is conceptualized as something that is experienced by people of color, right? So I will just start with a disclosure. I'm 100% anti-realist about race. I also prepared that model of processes of racialization that I think can be very useful for biomedical research, but I don't have the time today to talk about it. The important thing is that, as I understand that racialization, it is a process or processes that affect individual on many different levels, including like socio-political, environmental, epigenetical, and so on. And due to the process, due to the process of racialization, a person is recognized by others as well as identify themselves as a representative of certain racialized group. But it doesn't need to be a group that is classified as a race in our common imaginary. There is also this question if this is really a racism. So there are other notions presented by some researchers, such as xenoracism. I really think that it's not the case, because in that kind of conceptions or frameworks, usually xenoracism or xenophobia is like this biologizing stereotypes that goes with it. And I will show you in a second that the biologization and racialization of individuals that have a lighter skin actually happens here in Europe a lot, and not only in Europe generally. Another thing is that there are many voices that understanding racism just in terms of skin color may be too reductionist, and in fact, many different features can be a subject of biologization and essentialization, and thus acquire racial meaning or racial equity. So now I'm going to talk about this new area of research about racialization of Eastern Europeans. Ivan Kalmar wrote this book, White But Not Quite, 2 years ago, in which he argued that it's not really about white privilege. Sorry, it's actually about white privilege. Oh my God, again. I'm so sorry. Like, I have such an interesting presentation.
I know, it's fine.
Yeah. So yeah, I just need to look here probably, really. Yeah, so even Kalmar argued that it is really white privilege, not whiteness as such, that is at stake here. And there are also other voices that whiteness as a racialized status should not be reduced to any sort of simple synonym for Europeanness, for example. And why is that? In history, we have many examples when racism affected people racialized not on the basis of their skin color, but for example, on the basis of their religion. One of such groups is a group racialized as Slavs or Eastern Europeans. You may probably never heard about it, but it's a very common phenomena actually. And for example, there are arguments that trading Slavs, so Eastern Europeans such as Poles and so on, were happening on such a great scale that the word slave actually comes from the word Slav. Interestingly, in Eastern Europe, racialization was affecting not only certain populations as Eastern Europeans and the different nations, like Poles used to have those beliefs that Ukrainians have a black mouth inside, for example, because they are a different race and so on, but also affected different classes. So in Poland, it was very popular to racialize peasants. Nobility thought that they are a different race. They called themselves Sarmats, and they said that they shouldn't, combine their blood with peasants. And there was also a very popular racial science in Poland affecting peasants. In 16th century, there were many like pseudo scientists or scientists at that time looking for differences in shapes of bones and skulls. And they, for example, had those ideas that some pieces of skulls of European peasants are resembling agricultural tools in shape, so they are actually born to work. It was going with like a lot of different stereotypes. For example, that they have a thicker skin, and they are stupid, of course, and they should be ruled by others because they are not smart enough. Of course, they also didn't feel pain, so they could be totally exploited by their owners. There are also other examples. It was happening not only in USA, for example, not only in Europe. Sorry, for example, in the USA, Irish women were participating in some experiments with women racialized as Black or African American, experiments performed by a gynecologist, James Marion Sims, who didn't use anesthesia on them. And why he used Black women and Irish women? Because apparently both of representatives of both of those groups had thicker nerves and were more resistant to pain. And here are just few illustrations. Those are a map of racialized groups or maps of I'm awful, I know. So here is, for example, the map presented by Woodbridge. It presents different populations in Europe. Some of them are savage and barbarian. Some of them are civilized. And of course, like all part of the Eastern Europe is generally half civilized or barbaric, of course. This is another ethno-racial classification presented by Deniker. He actually recognized 6 main racial groups in Europe and 4 like subgroups. That kind of narrations usually were produced together with arguments that the groups that are recognized as less civilized or different races are also stupider, of course, right? Because why not? We need them for work. So there were even like very explicit arguments that, for example, people from Slavic countries, so like Slavic Alpines, that was a race here in Europe, like it was a race in one of the classifications, that Slavic Alpines are dangerous for Nordics, so like Aryan race in Nazi vocabulary, and that other races like Aryan race shouldn't actually like, you know, mix with Alpines. Interestingly, some racist scholars or pseudo scholars also argued that in the USA, many migrants from Eastern Europe came to the USA, and they are now a danger for Nordics that came there before, so they shouldn't mix as well. Here are some quotes regarding this problem. And finally, a map of races in Europe published in National Geographic in 1919. Those are races of Europe. The whole green part are Slavic races. The orange and like reddish and pinkish, those are Nordic races. So those are those cool races, right? And Slavic races are those stupid races that are that were sometimes conceptualized as the Alpine races, which is always and everywhere a race of peasants, unagricultural, and never a maritime race. In fact, they only extend to salt water, something. This race is essentially of the soil, and in towns the type is mediocre and bourgeois. And that kind of narratives were also included in a Nazi narratives about different nations, ethnicities, or so-called races in Europe, right? It was also included in works of racist scholarships such as Arthur Comte de Gobineau, who wrote that Russians, Poles, and Serbians, they will say, even though they are far nearer to us than the Negroes, are only civilized on the surface. In effect, people in Poland were treated as an inferior race. But this is not only a historical issue. There are many studies showing that people who are from Eastern Europe are still being racialized. They are imagined somewhere between whiteness and blackness, and they usually don't have full access to so-called white privilege, similarly as people in European West. This is the image of Eastern European family that I generated with a chat GPD or some kind of tool like that. So you can trust me, no, not every family looks like that in Poland at the moment. By what this is important for medicine and research in racism and health inequities. There are many research focusing on the fact that Eastern Europeans statistically live a few years less than Western Europeans. This phenomena is usually called as East-West health gap. Of course, there are many different reasons to that, right? I will just focus on the example of COVID-19 pandemic. And during that time, regardless of the method used, so there were many different studies, people in Poland and other Eastern European countries were much more affected by COVID, and much more of them died. To discuss this issue, I'll also focus only on two different countries that are very close to each other, Germany and Poland. And I will discuss it from the perspectives. One of them is the perspective of pre-existing differences, and the other is a perspective of. No. So those are, this is the illustration for the East-West health gap. So when it comes to the pre-existing inequities in healthcare infrastructure, of course, it's nothing new to say that there are huge differences between the bloc of Eastern Europe, so East Soviet, ex-Soviet bloc, and the European West, right? So generally, there are some information here about, for example, public health expenditure or the fact that infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure in Eastern Europe is usually underdeveloped and underfinanced, right? So there's a lot of problems with proper access to healthcare, proper access to treatments, and so on. But there are also other differences that are important in this context, such as the fact that generally the society in Poland is much poorer. It works much longer hours. So in fact, every kind of health issues can develop quicker if the people don't have enough time to, for example, rest. In terms of COVID, what is important is the fact that the rate of overcrowding in the housing, so the situation when people don't have their rooms, for example, is much higher in Poland. The education rate is lower, and so on. And you can say that this is just because of the historical trajectories, because of the geography, and so on. But I say that, okay, but if we know that from the, like, I don't know, 7th century, people who lived in Eastern Europe were racialized as stupid peasants that are good to work, but nothing more, then I think it can be an important factor affecting the development of such inequities. And those are just few illustrations of that, like availability of PET scanners in the Eastern Europe. In Europe, generally, those are from Eurostat. Practicing dentists, practicing caring personnel, physicians. I like this one, the number of psychiatrists. Another statistics from Eurostat is saying that people in Poland, that like we have a very small amount of people who suffer from depression and anxiety and so on. And that's a fact. But this is because usually people cannot afford going to psychiatrists and psychologists. So of course they are not in the statistics, right? Gender health gap. And like, if you check, you will find that kind of inequities in almost every aspect. This is, for example, like minimum wages and death rates from alcohol consumption. In the literature, death rates from alcohol consumption are usually like, or are sometimes described as a death of despair. The individual consumption, and in the end, differences in health, in air quality, because you probably know that in many cases, production from cheaper countries, countries that were conceptualized as cheaper as in India and China, moved to Eastern Europe in like 10, 15 years ago, because the work was just cheaper there. But this is not only a matter of pre-existing differences, it's also a problem with direct experiences of racism and of the brain drain and care drain that is happening at the moment. So, for example, most of the doctors that study in Poland, that are educated in Poland, after finishing study, they moved to different Western European countries because they have better conditions. They can get higher salaries. Also, during the pandemic, that happened a lot. It's also not only a matter of doctors and nurses, but also other caring workers. So, for example, in 2021, at least 300,000 migrants from Eastern Europe worked in care-dependent households in Germany, of which 2/3 did not have a contract and full access to healthcare, which is crucial here. So most of those people are educated in Poland on the cost of Eastern European countries. Then they are hired in Western European countries that depend on their work, but usually they don't have any contracts and access to health insurance. And that also happened a lot during the COVID pandemic, and it's still happening. During the COVID pandemic, many internal and external borders were kept open certainly for seasonal and care workers. And it was actually affecting the development of even stronger inequalities, because in most cases, the cost of the healthcare after they get back to their countries was, of course, on the side of the Eastern European countries. And here you have some quotes from from newspapers such as Guardian, when it comes to racialization of those migrants, right? So, for example, people used to say that most Germans are not used to working stopped in the in the fields for hours on end. They complain about backache. Romanians and Poles are stronger and they work weekends and public holidays. And so on and so on and so on. There is and I'm finishing, yeah. The explicit notions of racialization of Eastern European migrants during the pandemic occurred even in mainstream discourse. For example, some politicians in Germany explicitly say that Eastern Europeans are a invasive virus-carrying species. So I believe that that kind of beliefs, racialization beliefs, also affect people's choices when it comes to education, career tracks, and so on. And they also, of course, affect their healthcare and the fact that they can be a part of the argumentation that makes them, for example, refuse going to the hospital when they need a treatment. And I have a lot of different jokes and even quotes from J.K. Rowling about some Poles. If you are interested, but I think I don't have that much time to describe all of it in great details. Anyway, I really wanted to say that using the category of whites as a category of a default homogenized control group in research of on racism and health inequities, especially in Europe, but also in other regions, really is a problem and can make experiences of some racialized groups totally invisible. Thank you. Oh.
No. Oh, okay.
Thank you.
That was great. I have nothing critical to say, but I feel like I should come up with something.
Yes, please.
Because so what is to stop? So there is an alternative way of framing all of these kind of the cause of these inequalities on kind of national socioeconomic differences, right? So what is the advantage to using a racism framework? And how does that make this, what is the advantage, number one? Because the worry is that people who use this kind of explanatory framework can be accused of, say, like white people co-opting anti-racist dialogue, right?
So I totally agree with that kind of concerns, and I was thinking about it like really a lot. And sometimes I always question myself, it should be called racism or something else. But generally, while getting deeper into that kind of research, I'm more and more sure that that is racism actually. And the notion of racism that focus only on the most mainstream ethno-racial beliefs is really like some kind of colonial and essentialist thinking about this phenomena, because we have a lot of historical, cultural examples when racism was developed instead of skin color, right? And of course, we can say that now white people are trying to adapt this framework to their needs. But at the same time, people from Eastern Europe and all the researchers that are focused on that kind of analysis, they always underline, and I also want to underline, that no one wants to equate the long-standing and very difficult experiences of people who are racialized, like people of color. No one is saying that our position here is the same. For example, because the race, like my place in this hierarchy depends, for example, on the fact that I speak. As long as I don't talk, my identity is invisible. So if I don't talk, it's okay. But as fast as I will speak, and people hear my strong Eastern European accent, I was in England 8 times before. 2 times it was for conferences, scientific conferences, and another 6 times it was to clean toilets in England during my PhD studies. And I was usually interpreted as a sex worker. If I go to the doctor with a bladder infection, they ask me to make a chlamydia test, not to give me antibiotics, because I'm from Poland. And I also get a bone for a soap from my boss from the hotel, because she said, "Oh, you're from Poland, you can buy yourself something nice." So I could buy myself a soap in Boots, right? So of course, that kind of experiences are not only typical for people who are racialized, but if we look closer and be honest about history of Europe, right? About all of that. So those are people who actually invented those kind of racism, racial hierarchies. And they also recognized Eastern Europeans or Slavs as inferior race, right? So why we should say, okay, but you have this mainstream racial discourse in UK and in other colonial countries in which this discourse is formed, and you don't listen to our position.
There is a finger.
Joanna, thank you so much. Another fabulous, fabulous presentation, really, really helpful and stimulating. You're flagging why racists are problematic for all sorts of reasons, and one of those is that they've presented all sorts of definitional challenges, you know, in terms of how these sorts of terms were used and the implications that they pose for us today. Is it at all helpful, you know, sort of based a little bit on Arjun's challenge, to think about synonymous terms like caste systems or classism? You know, so we look at the example of Glasgow, where life expectancy differs from one part of the city to another. And it very much is along the lines of classes and the way people were viewed historically in Glasgow as working class, etc. And those sorts of challenges persist today in different parts of India, and caste systems. And that's not to say there is a complexity in India associated with skin color as well as caste in the way that they're defined and used. But I just wondered whether you've looked at these sorts of synonyms and how they've been established in different contexts and what the implications are. But yeah, thank you so much.
So thank you for this question. I'm actually really into the concept of racial capitalism in this context. So the framework that that combine like racism or consider racism as a tool for capitalism that divide people to exploit them historically. It is a tool that can be adjusted to different contexts, and this is why I also added this slide about about the model of concept of racialization, processes of racialization for research in healthcare, because I really believe that race as a proxy is not always a good category, even in studies about racism and health. In most cases, as you said, the information about people's socioeconomic situation is even more relevant, or where they live, their like environment, right? But when it comes to research on racism and health inequities, it is also important to add this aspect of individuals' experiences, so experiences of racialization, right? And there are some researchers that make that kind of research broader. So they, for example, use different like scales of vulnerability, right? But this is very rare at the moment. Usually most of that kind of studies focus on ethno-racial inequities, right? And when we talk about that kind of problems, then experience of like explicit experience of racialization, feeling that you are like generally don't belong here, like I totally feel that I don't belong here, to be honest. They are usually not recognized by that kind of studies. So what I'm trying to say, this is maybe not the perfect thing, but at least we need to acknowledge that using this very like popular framework that we use today is totally unreliable. From that moment, we can try to think like what kind of experiences also affected. So in many cases, of course, the experiences of people who are from LGBT communities and who experience that kind of aggression, right? They also affect their health. So we just need to analyze in what kind of situations people's vulnerability is important, in which of them their ethno-racial identity is important, in which of them their, I don't know, neighborhood and socioeconomic status is more important, right? And this is why I tried to put that kind of analysis in just one frame to show that depending on the goal of the research, different categories should be used as a proxy in studies.
There's a question online. Person online, do they want to speak or, oh? If you want to speak, Margot, Stans, maybe?
Yes, hello. I had a very similar question, so it's already answered, but thank you so much for the presentation.
Okay, thanks. I'll ask a question then, if I may. I inserted myself in the queue. Yeah, great. And also, I mean, from my perspective, this is so accurate, right? So I'm also other white, but I'm Dutch. So I get to be in like the cool zone, and my experience is radically unlike what, people who live a couple of 100 kilometers to the east from where I was born experience, I think, in the UK. So one question is it worth, or question or suggestion? I think US racial history also in many ways steps into this, right? So the way that like European immigration was classed as like the Irish, the Italian, all of which were considered lesser than the Anglo-American and the Protestant Dutch that were like praised into the same scheme. Okay, you agree with that? And one question is, oh, well, you kind of covered this, but I just wondered, how do you distinguish between kind of, and maybe you don't need to, but kind of direct, capital R racialization effects and, a long history of economic difference, right? And difference in like GDP and economic welfare, which of course partially goes back to the Iron Curtain in Europe, which of course itself preys upon distinctions, but nonetheless. And a last question, and I think this really supports your position that this is a issue of race or racialization and perceived race. It's like, what is this about Scandinavia that it gets to be in, right? Because it really is strange. Like there's two kind of rough axes in Europe, right? There's the axis that goes from north to south. So from a Dutch perspective, I mean, the French already start to look a little bit dark. The Italians and the Spanish, I mean, white, but this sort of, they're a bit short as well. But then the Polish also get to be kind of, nicely white. Well, they're Slavic cheekbones and that kind of thing. All that, you can see how that plays into the hands of the, obviously, Britain, which has been massively dominant economically, culturally. Arguably, the Dutch colonial power, big maritime power is the same difference. But then the Scandinavians just lift along on this, we haven't done anything since Vikings. So, and that does, but being a bit crude here, but that does really suggest that, people do want to strongly morph this on a kind of a perceived biological group to which those, the Scandinavians are seen to belong, rather than just picking out linguistic or
So you're totally right. Like, this is why I'm still sticking with this argument that it's more about racism and racialization than just about xenophobia, for example, because as you said, that kind of narratives usually were constructed basing on some kind of evolutionary, then like genetically affected, or like, based on the measurements of skulls. Fun fact, in collections of remains in Europe, because there is this huge discussion about repatriation of remains, right? So most institutions already repatriated most of the remains from their past colonies and so on. So I asked in Göttingen, where they have a Blumenbach's collection, what kinds of skulls they still have, and most of them are Eastern Europeans who were also exhibited as inferior race there, but we don't have that kind of discussions in Poland. Like, we don't talk about different relations between, I don't know, Europe, Poland and Ukraine because we don't have space for that because there is a war, for example. So we are like pre-post-racial society, I would say. So we don't do research on racism and health, for example. We also don't do much research on racism generally in Poland. There is a growing area of research on racialization of peasants generally. So different racialized science looking for differences in status, right? But looking for race and talking about it in terms of a race specifically. So yeah, I would say that you are totally right. The fact that people from Scandinavia are included, it's because they look as Germans who were Nazi Germans would like themselves, and all of them would like to look like. So that was this ideal, to be tall, light haired and light eyes, tall with a long skull. I have a very small skull, so I don't.
They make a very
Yeah.
popular sperm donors, apparently.
Yeah, so that kind of narratives were always based on biology, because when they are based on biology, they appear to be more universal. So it was more useful to use them and apply them to exploit people.
I have a finger and then a thumb. Oh, 2 fingers. Okay, well, I'm happy to run ever so slowly. Like, if I want a microphone, it's way that
Thank you. So, okay, so this is, I'm going to push back again, right? Because so you like explicitly said that you are an anti-realist about race, and I'm just thinking, who are
Anti-racist,
you? Who is the interlocutor here?
Yeah.
If you're trying to speak to people who are biological realists, then your argument doesn't necessarily speak to that, right? Because they can say, they can accept that there are finer grains of analysis. There are subcategories of white people, but that doesn't mean that white isn't a legitimate biological category. And then
Okay.
if you're talking to anti-realists, they might say that that historical narratives, we can accept the historical narrative, and that the historical narrative is very similar to historical narratives about colonization, historical narratives about, we can also accept that the phenomenology might be very similar, and deny that this is an appropriate appropriation,
Yeah.
because the frameworks and dialogue and literature around racism are for the specific groups that developed it, right?
So
It's like, we made this for us, you make something for you, right? So you can, so on both sides of the argument,
okay.
someone can say no.
All right. So it's like, I'm not gonna teach anyone, like I'm not gonna ask anyone to accept the fact that I feel I experienced racism a lot in my life. And I know a lot of people who also did it, had that kind of experiences. Like, I don't know if you had to, for example, get naked on crossing a border, because I had to, going to Germany. And I had like investigation, because they had, so the, you know, the car was having a white plates. Sorry, white plate, the Polish numbers, right? Like the Polish numbers, and so on and so on and so on. So of course, I totally get that this is something that we didn't develop. But at the same time, I have no idea how to name it differently if all of the conceptual pieces fit so to such a great extent. Like, how then, what is then the difference between my experience there is this difference. Yeah, as I said, my experience, my place is easily very contextual. But at the same time, I think generally the state of current state of a person's racialization, so where they feel and how they feel, how they are racialized and how they are racialized by themselves and by others, is strongly contextual. And it's not stable. It's changing over time, and it depends on the situation. I was working with people of colors in many places, and in most of those places, I felt inferior because my English was worse, and my economic situation was actually worse. So, you know, that this is why I am anti-realist about race, because I don't see any situation when it is a permanent category that is universal for a person and doesn't change. You know, people change their ethno-racial identities, and it also, the status also change depending on where they are. When I'm here, like, for me, it's very complex experience, really. When I'm in, if I would go to some country that struggles a lot economically, and have the strong history of white supremacism, of course, my situation probably would be much better. And I don't refuse that in such situation, I'll have a huge privilege, like really a huge privilege. I really acknowledge that. And I also acknowledge the fact that Eastern European countries used the fact that they were in Europe, so they were beneficiaries of racist system, even if they didn't have their own colonies, like official colonies and so on. So I just think that I really cannot, like, besides this ethical argument, that this is my tool and I don't want to give you, like, this is my toy and I don't want to give it to anyone else. I don't see any other arguments, actually.
Thank you. I thought that was great, and I agree. So this is a finger on the thinking of parallels with the U.S. And European case. So one thing you can, so for instance, Noel Irvin Painter in the History of White People, lots of people note, yes, I mean, during different waves of immigration by Europeans in the US, there was racism against, say, Italians or the Irish. There were like political parties like the No Nothings and so on, whose entire point was to be racist against them. But the other point was that once you see convergence, assimilation, economic prosperity and so on, these things they are so quick to disappear, right? Within 2 generations, you go from the Know Nothings being a powerful political force, anti-Irish party in Massachusetts, to the Kennedy family, Irish Catholic, being the quintessential family of kind of like the upper class, right? So then the thought is really there is racism and then there's racialization, but this is kind of extremely sensitive to these kinds. And then in the European case, as you note, I mean, this is the promise of the European project is, you know, one day Poland will be as rich as Germany. Probably Poland will be richer than the UK very, very, very soon, right? So then, I mean, it's an economy that's growing and this is an economy that's stagnating, right? So it might be hard while we're in it to see it, right? Just as it might be hard in the mid-19th century to see the Kennedys. But so then my question to you is there, for instance, can you see evidence with development? Are there regions that exit the kind of, you know, the sub-racializations that disappear, become less meaningful, etc., as a result of it? Or because there are times when you talk in the kind of US anti-realist sense, yes, I mean, race is just, we make it up to help with these kinds of political tasks, but it's very easy to shift. But then other times when you talk about it as if it's as persistent as you might think of, for instance, not sub-racial categorization, but cross-racial, right, between Black and white and so on. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I understood correctly. So you asked if there are some kind of examples where the some kind of like, I don't know, racialized groups. Mm,
Right, so that I guess I sneakily ask two questions. One question is, in the US case, it's meant to be, look at this sub-racialization that simply ceases to make sense anymore. No one thinks that Italian is a sub-race of white anymore. I mean, go to parts of New York City if people think, but you get the point. So it's so as a kind of society, we kind of, are there examples in Europe where this happens, where there are sub-racial categories where you're like, what are you talking about, or it's kind of strange?
Yeah.
And then the second is, do you think Eastern European, this is like that, where it will, or do you think it's much more persistent in the way that how we racialize, for instance, like, you know, not like made up stuff, but like, people, you know, like.
Yeah. So I think in Europe, this is a highly like dynamic situation at the moment, and there are many different like people who are usually racialized as Eastern Europeans. They are this is a combination of very different languages, ethnicities, cultures, and religions. So usually they are huge races, not only against people of color, but also against other Eastern Europeans. Like, for example, as I said, in Poland, there was this belief in a black, like inside of the mouth of Ukrainians, that they are like evil and so on. In Ukraine, some people have that kind of beliefs about Poles. Few years ago, like before the war in Ukraine started, there was a lot of racism between those two countries, both sides, including many different like biologizing beliefs, as I said, about thicker bones, again, about like lower IQs and so on and so on and so on. It changed at the beginning of the war for a small period of a time when a Polish and Ukrainian society, which at some point of a time was even one country, like, you know, there is a huge problem because like Poland disappeared, and then, you know, then it was recognized again on the map, and like it combines a lot of different people. But the political context is changing it a lot. And we have like many different racialized groups, like Romani people, who are by some countries recognized as different populations. For example, like Romani people in Poland, after the war, starting of the war in Ukraine, they were our Romani people, but Ukrainian Romani people didn't get access to healthcare and no support at all, because there were Ukrainian Romani people, right? And there were some like others. So we have like very different narratives here that are problematic. In Poland, we have many different minorities that understand themselves as other, and also understood themselves as other races, for example, as like people who live in Ślązacy. Also people who live on the border between Belarus and Poland, they used to call themselves tutejsi, so people from here. They have their different language and so on. But when it comes to Ślązacy, they were also recognized as a better race by Nazi Germans. So they collaborated at some point of the time. Now they only recognize themselves as a minority, like ethnic minority with different language. But there were some movements to make them like separate state or something like that. So it's like a very, very dynamic situation. And just one more anecdote maybe on the end.
I really want to make space for the final question, but we're running out of time. So
Yeah.
is it okay if we have that? And
Also, I can ask my question over line.
Yeah.
but try and keep your response short.
Yeah.
I just my question was just for example, so like in the UK, let's say, like what kinds of categories should researchers use, or how should they collect their data? I mean, I was just thinking whether sometimes, I mean, it suddenly seems like racism or something like it against Eastern Europeans is like, is Eastern European like the relevant important category, or should it be like just aggregated perhaps by nationality? Should there be something about migrant status?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, like in many countries in Europe, actually, this migrant status is used as a proxy for race. And this is funny because like in Germany and France, it's used as a proxy for race in research. So if you're like first or second generation of migrant, right, it counts, and they use it in all research about health inequities. So I think that should be probably a combination of few different like categories that that should be taken into account, because of course, like class here matters a lot. The migration status or legal status matters a lot. In some cases, like particularly in research on health inequities, that kind of like probably like language. If someone is a native speaker, their status and the situation in certain countries is totally different, right? And for example, they can access healthcare much more easily. In that one research on health inequities in UK that recognized Eastern Europeans, it was about about the barriers in healthcare in the UK, and the outcomes of Eastern Europeans were totally, like almost totally the same as other racialized minorities here. So for example, they struggled when it comes to language. They felt patronized, like they felt this strong feeling of epistemic inequity. Similarly, in Norway, I have many friends who live there. So for example, they look for doctors who are from Eastern Europe as well, because otherwise they usually don't get like access to antibiotics. They don't get prescription drugs, or they are not like, you know, asked to do some kind of tests, because usually they are like, okay, you probably you are probably fine, like, you know, you know nothing. So Eastern Europeans in Norway and that kind of countries, they usually look for healthcare workers who can understand them, not only because of the language, but also will treat them seriously as another human being, as a partner, not as a cleaner, right? Or something like that. So probably language, probably economic status, legal status, and so on. But as I said, it differs. Like probably when it comes to like research in genomics and genetics, I really believe that race is not a proxy at all. And even there are some. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, sorry.
No, it's very good. We can continue these conversations over lunch. Please join me in thanking Joanna for a great talk. Thank you.